All right, so today we're diving into Flutter app development.
Oh, fun.
And you know what? We're tackling a topic that can be a little bit tricky,
Oh,
especially
yeah.
for newcomers. It's state management.
I have heard about this.
But don't worry, though. We're here to break it down
Okay.
with Provider.
At provider.
It's a package that's known for being really powerful,
Mm-hmm.
but also surprisingly user-friendly.
So it's kind of like a good balance then
Yeah,
between like gets the job done, but also isn't like super intimidating to learn.
exactly.
Right, yeah.
It's like the perfect balance,
Yeah,
between those two things.
I like that.
And it's interesting how often state management trips people up,
Yeah, it does.
you know?
It really does.
Like good state management is kind of what keeps an app from feeling like
Mm-hmm.
that old website
Right.
that, has to reload entirely every time you click something.
Oh, totally. Yeah, you don't want to feel like you're back in the,
Right.
early internet
The
days.
digital Stone Age.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, where everything is just taking forever to load.
Exactly. And we're going for smooth and responsive and modern apps here.
Of course, who isn't?
And our guide for this deep dive is this really detailed article all about Provider.
Awesome.
It's in Spanish, though.
Oh, okay.
It's called Provider Gestionando el Estado de tu Aplicación Flutter. Una guía completa.
That's a mouthful.
It is.
Yeah.
But we've gone through and pulled out all the most important information so you don't have to.
Perfect.
So before we get lost in all the details, can you kind of give us a big picture view of like what is Provider all about?
Yeah, absolutely. So at its core, provider is based on this concept called the provider design pattern,
Okay.
which is really all about making your code more modular and reusable.
Modularity.
Yeah, think about it like a well-organized kitchen.
Okay, I like this analogy.
You got different containers for different ingredients, so
Right.
everything is easy to find, and you don't end up with a jumbled mess.
Right, it's all organized.
Exactly. Provider does the same thing for your app's data. Keeps different parts of your state separate and manageable.
Gotcha. So it's like a system for organizing and sharing data within our app.
Exactly.
But how does this sharing actually work in practice?
So imagine a family sharing resources.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Maybe someone is in charge of the TV remote,
Okay,
someone else baked cookies.
perfect.
Everyone benefits.
Yeah, everyone's happy.
Provider works in a similar way.
Okay.
Widgets can provide values like pieces of data to their children,
Okay.
which are the widgets nested within them.
So like a flow of information passing down.
Exactly. It's this
Yeah.
neat flow of information passing down through your app structure.
That's really cool.
Yeah,
So it's almost like a chain of command for data.
I like that.
Yeah, I like that too.
Chain of command for data. I'm going to use that.
Yeah, you should.
All right.
So once we have, this data being shared, how do our widgets actually tap into it?
Yes.
I'm guessing there's more than one way to access it, right?
You're absolutely right. Provider gives you a few different options,
Okay.
each with their own advantages.
Okay.
The most straightforward way is using a provider.fft context.
Provider.fft context.
It's like saying, hey, I need that piece of data of type T from the provider up the widget tree.
Oh, okay.
So like reaching up to grab the cookie jar when you want a treat.
Okay, I got it.
Simple and direct.
But what if you only want a tiny little nibble of that cookie?
Okay.
Not the whole thing.
Right.
What if you only need a small part of your widget to update when the data changes?
Mm-hmm.
Like rebuilding the entire thing seems a bit much, doesn't it?
You've hit on a crucial point.
Okay.
Rebuilding an entire widget when only a small part of it needs to change
Yeah.
can be really inefficient.
Especially for like complex UIs.
Especially for complex UIs, that's where consumer T comes in.
Consumer T.
It's like saying, I only want to be notified and rebuild this specific part of my widget when the data changes.
Okay, so it's more targeted.
They're much more targeted.
So more efficient.
Way more efficient, and it leads to a much smoother user experience.
Yeah, nobody wants a janky app.
Exactly.
All right, so before we dive into how to actually use these methods, maybe we should take a step back.
Okay.
How do we even set up Provider in the first place?
That's a good question.
It can't be that hard, can it?
It's actually pretty straightforward.
Okay, yeah.
Think of it like adding a new ingredient to your app's recipe.
Okay.
You start by adding the provider package to your pubspec.yaml file.
Okay.
This file is like your app's shopping list,
I like it.
where you specify all the external packages that you want to use.
Okay.
Then you run a simple command Flutter pub get,
Okay.
which is like telling Flutter to go to the store and fetch all the ingredients on your list.
It's going shopping for us.
Exactly. Flutter's doing the shopping.
Perfect. I love it.
Yeah.
So we have it installed now.
Yep.
How do we make it available to our app?
So to make sure Provider can work its magic throughout your entire app, you'll do a little setup in your main.dart file.
Main.dart.
This file is like the entry point of your app, the place where everything starts.
Yeah.
You're going to wrap your main app widget with Change Notifier Provider, which essentially says, hey, this is the provider that will manage the state for my app.
All right. Change Notifier Provider. That sounds important.
It is very important.
So do we, create the provider itself within Change Notifier Provider?
Yes, you do.
Okay.
But before you create the provider, you first need to define what data you actually want to share and manage.
Right.
So let's imagine we're building a simple counter app.
Okay. Simple counter app.
We need a model to hold the counter value, right?
Right.
That's where our counter model class comes in.
Counter model.
It's just a simple class that stores the counter and allows us to increment it.
All right. So we've got this counter model holding our precious counter data.
We do.
But how does it actually tell the rest of the app when the counter changes?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Does it shout it from the rooftops or?
Not quite from the rooftops,
Right.
but it does need a way to announce those changes.
Okay.
That's where Change Notifier comes in.
Change Notifier.
It's like giving our counter model a little loudspeaker so it can notify any interested widgets whenever the counter value updates.
Okay, so it can announce it.
Exactly.
But how does it know when to make the announcement?
So within our counter model, every time we change the counter value,
Mm-hmm.
let's say we increment it,
Okay.
we also call a special method called Notify Listeners.
Notify listeners.
Think of this method as our model raising a flag.
Okay.
And saying, hey, everyone, something has changed over here. You might want to check it out.
It's raising the alarm.
Exactly.
So whenever, someone interacts with the counter and changes its value, Notify listeners sends out an alert.
Yes.
And any widgets that care about the counter can update themselves accordingly.
That is exactly how it works.
Very cool.
Yeah.
But do we have to listen for these changes from every widget in our app,
That's a great question.
even if they don't care about the counter?
And it highlights the importance of choosing the right way to access your provider.
Okay.
Remember, provider.ft context and consumer T's.
Yeah.
Provider.ft context gives you direct access to the provider.
Okay.
But it can sometimes lead to unnecessary widget rebuilds if you're not careful.
Right, because if every widget using provider.fft context rebuilds whenever Notify listeners is called,
Yeah.
things could get really slow.
Exactly, and that's why consumer T is so valuable.
Okay.
It lets you specify exactly which part of your widget tree needs to rebuild when the provider's data changes.
Gotcha.
So only the widgets that truly care about the counter will be notified and updated.
So it's all about efficiency then?
All about efficiency.
Okay. This is making a lot of sense.
Good.
Now I see another method mentioned in this article.
Okay.
Selector T. What is that one all about?
Selector T.
Is it even more selective than consumer T?
You could say
Oh,
that Selector T is like consumer T on steroids.
Okay.
It
Yeah.
lets you be super specific about which changes in the data trigger a rebuild.
Okay. So if you have a complex model with multiple pieces of data, but your widget only cares about one specific value,
Right.
Selector T allows you to just focus on that value.
Okay, so it's like hyper-focus.
Hyper-focus. That's a good word for it.
Okay. So to recap,
Yeah.
we have our counter model holding the data,
Uh-huh.
change notifier, broadcasting those changes.
Okay.
And then widgets can kind of listen in with these different levels of precision
Can.
using, provider.fft context, consumer T, or selector T.
Precisely.
This is really coming together now.
I'm glad to hear that.
But can you explain a bit more about why change notifier is so crucial to this whole setup?
Yeah.
What makes it the engine of this state management machine?
What's really fascinating about Change Notifier is that it acts as this central hub for state changes in your app.
Okay.
Think of it like an air traffic controller,
Okay.
coordinating all the incoming and outgoing data.
Keeping everything flowing smoothly.
Exactly. So when you change the data in your model,
Calling notify listeners is like sending a signal to all the listening widgets, telling them, hey, things have changed. Update yourselves accordingly.
Gotcha. So it's like an automatic refresh system
It is.
that keeps the UI in sync with the data at all times.
At all times, no more manual refreshing, just smooth reactive updates.
This is awesome.
It is pretty cool.
But, as your app grows,
Mm-hmm.
you might start dealing with much more complex state than just a simple counter.
Oh, for sure.
You might have user profiles and shopping carts and settings and all these things.
Absolutely.
How do we handle all of that with provider?
That is a fantastic question.
It sounds like we might need more than one provider to manage all that complexity.
We might.
Is there a way to organize multiple providers within our app?
There is, and that's where we'll pick things up in the next part of our deep dive.
Oh, I can't wait.
Yeah, we'll explore how provider scales to handle more intricate scenarios using concepts like multi-provider and nested providers.
Okay, multi-provider and nested providers.
Those are the keys to the kingdom.
I can't wait to unlock those secrets.
Me too.
Until then, dear listeners, let this all sink in and imagine the possibilities of what you can build with provider.
The possibilities are endless.
We'll be back soon to delve even deeper into the world of Flutter state management.
Can't wait.
Welcome back.
It's good to be back.
Last time we laid a solid foundation in the world of provider.
Yeah, we did.
We talked about how it helps us organize and share data within our Flutter apps, keep things nice and neat.
Like a well-stocked kitchen.
Just like a well-stocked kitchen.
Exactly.
And we talked about all the different methods
Yes.
our widgets can use to access that data.
Like provider.oft context.
Provider.oft context.
For that direct access.
Yeah.
Consumer T for those more targeted updates.
Yep.
And then selector T for when you need that, fine-grained control.
That's right. It was like we took a peek behind the curtain
Yeah.
and we saw how provider helps us build those smooth and responsive apps.
It's the map.
Yeah. But you hinted that things can get even more sophisticated
Oh, yeah.
when we're dealing with larger apps and more complex data.
For sure.
So where do we go from here?
All right. So managing a simple counter, that's one thing.
Right.
But as your app grows, you're inevitably going to need to handle multiple pieces of state simultaneously.
Yeah, it's going to get complicated.
It does get complicated.
So how does provider help us manage that kind of complexity?
Oh,
You mentioned something called multi-provider, right?
multi-provider, yes.
Is that our solution?
It is one of the solutions.
Okay.
It's like having a central command center
Okay.
for all of your providers. Instead of having them scattered throughout your widget tree,
Right.
you can neatly bundle them together under one roof.
Okay. So it keeps our code organized.
Keeps your code organized, makes those providers easily accessible to
Okay.
any widget that needs them.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
But now I'm also remembering something else you mentioned earlier.
Okay.
Nested providers.
Uh,
When would we want to use those?
So nested providers come into play when you need these isolated pockets of state
Okay.
within specific parts of your app.
Right.
It's like having separate departments within a company,
Okay.
each responsible for managing its own data and workflows.
Oh, so it's like creating these mini state management ecosystems
Like little mini ecosystems.
within our app.
Uh-huh.
Okay. Can you give me a concrete example
Sure.
of when this would be useful?
Let's imagine you're building a social media app,
Okay, social media.
and you have a user profile screen.
Right.
This screen might have different sections for like posts and followers and settings.
Mm-hmm.
Each of these sections could benefit from having its own nested provider to manage its own specific data.
Okay, that makes sense.
Right.
The posts section might need to keep track of like which posts are liked.
Yep.
The follower section would manage, the list of followers.
Exactly.
And the settings section would handle like notifications or privacy preferences.
You got it. By using these nested providers, you ensure that the state for each section is nicely contained.
Right.
And doesn't interfere with other parts of the profile screen.
So it's like a well-organized filing system.
It is.
For our state.
Keeps everything in its place.
This is all great.
Good.
I'm really starting to appreciate how these advanced provider features help us build these scalable apps.
Yeah.
But something that's often top of mind for developers, especially when building complex applications, is clean architecture.
Clean architecture.
Yeah, have you heard of this?
I have.
It's a way of structuring your app
Yeah.
to keep it, maintainable and adaptable as it grows.
Right.
Clean architecture sounds impressive.
It is a pretty cool concept.
But I'll be honest, I'm not entirely familiar with it.
Okay.
Can you give me a quick rundown?
Sure. So imagine you're building a house.
Okay, house.
You wouldn't just start throwing bricks together randomly, would you?
That would be a mess.
It would be a disaster. You'd have a blueprint, a plan that outlines how different parts of the house fit together.
Right. A design?
Exactly. Clean architecture is kind of like a blueprint for your app.
Okay.
It guides you to separate your app into these distinct layers,
Okay.
each with a very specific responsibility.
Okay, so it's like creating a clear division of labor
It is.
within our app.
Yes.
So how many layers are there?
Typically, there are 3.
Okay.
You have the presentation layer.
Presentation.
And that's what the user sees.
Okay.
You have the domain layer.
Domain.
That's the business logic. And then the data layer.
Gotcha.
That's how the data is stored and retrieved.
Okay, so 3 layers.
3 layers.
Where does provider fit into all of this?
That's where things get really interesting.
Okay.
Provider can be seamlessly integrated into this clean architecture approach.
Right.
You can have providers that are dedicated to each layer, managing the state that's relevant to that layer's concerns.
So a presentation layer, which is responsible for the UI, could have providers that handle which screen is currently active or whether a loading indicator should be shown, things like that.
Yep.
And then our domain layer, which houses the core logic of our app, could have providers responsible for managing the data related to, calculations or validations, any complex operations.
Yep.
And then our data layer, which interacts with external data sources, like databases or APIs, could have providers dedicated to fetching and caching and managing that data.
Exactly. It's like having specialized teams working behind the scenes.
I like it.
Each handling a specific aspect of the data lifecycle.
This layered approach with provider seems really powerful.
It is.
It's a great way to build robust and scalable apps.
For sure.
But we can't forget about testing.
We can't.
How do we make sure that all this state management logic is working correctly?
You're absolutely right. Testing is essential.
Yeah.
Especially when you're dealing with state management, where even small errors can have these cascading effects on your app.
Yeah, that's a scary thought.
It is a bit scary.
Right.
The good news is that testing with provider is actually pretty straightforward.
Okay, good.
So do we just treat providers like any other class and write unit tests for them? You do.
Okay.
Because at the end of the day, providers are essentially classes that manage state.
Right.
So you can apply all those same testing principles that you'd use for any other class.
Okay, so for our counter model, we could write tests to make sure that the increment method actually increments the counter.
Yep.
And that notify listeners is called to trigger those UI updates.
Precisely.
And for providers that fetch data from external sources,
right,
like APIs, we'd want to mock those interactions during testing.
We would.
That way we can control the data that's being returned and make sure our providers can handle different scenarios.
Exactly.
Like successful data retrieval or network errors.
You got it.
This is making me feel much more confident about using provider.
I'm glad to hear that.
It's great to know that we have these tools and techniques to build robust and well-tested state management solutions.
Yeah, it's a powerful toolkit.
But I have a feeling there's even more to uncover.
There is.
What other provider secrets are waiting to be revealed?
Well, dear listeners, join us for the final part of our deep dive.
By 3.
Where we unlock even more provider potential.
Welcome back for the grand finale.
Here we are.
Of our provider deep dive.
I'm excited.
I am too. I'm excited to see what other provider tricks we have up our sleeves.
Oh, there's a few more.
We've covered so much already, from the basics to advanced patterns and even testing.
Yeah, it's been quite a journey.
It has.
And you've been doing great keeping up with it all.
Well, thank you.
It's clear you're ready to unlock some of provider's lesser known but equally powerful features.
Okay, bring it on.
All right, so have you heard of proxy provider?
Proxy provider?
Yeah.
It rings a bell, but I can't quite recall the details.
Okay, so think of it like a provider that's kind of a chameleon.
A chameleon?
Yeah.
Okay.
It can actually create other providers.
Wow.
But it only does this when certain conditions are met based on the state of existing providers.
So it's like dynamic.
Very dynamic.
Okay.
It's a way to dynamically manage which providers are active in your app.
Okay, that sounds intriguing, but a little abstract.
Okay.
Can you give me like a real-world example?
Of course. So imagine you're building an app that displays personalized recommendations for users.
Okay, personalized recommendations.
But you only want to start fetching those recommendations after the user has logged in.
Right, that makes sense.
So you could use a proxy provider to create a provider specifically for handling those recommendations.
Okay.
And it would only spring into action once a separate authentication provider signals that, hey, the user is logged in.
Oh, so it's like a chain reaction.
It is like a chain reaction.
Okay.
This provider relies on another provider.
I like that.
Yeah, it creates this dynamic kind of chain reaction effect where providers can depend on each other.
This is really cool.
Yeah. It's a pretty powerful concept.
And this level of control must be so valuable.
It is incredibly valuable.
For managing these like complex state flows and dependencies.
Especially as your app grows larger and more complex.
Yeah, you're essentially like orchestrating how different parts of your app state come into play and interact.
Yeah, it's like you're conducting the state management orchestra.
I love that.
Making sure everything is in sync and playing its part at the right time.
That's a great analogy.
Thank you.
Are there any other provider tools that can help us manage these complex interactions?
Well, we've talked a lot about, managing state and stuff.
Right.
But asynchronous operations are often a big part of state management as well.
Yeah, they can be tricky.
They can be.
Can handle.
So think about fetching data from a server or performing any task that takes time to complete.
Okay.
Provider has got you covered there too.
Okay, good.
With future provider and stream provider.
Feature provider and stream provider.
Yeah.
Okay, so asynchronous operations, I know they can make state management kind of a headache.
But they can.
How do these providers help us out?
They really take the pain out of managing the state of those operations.
Okay.
So let's go back to that example of fetching data from a server.
Mm-hmm.
With Future Provider, you can wrap that asynchronous operation and it will automatically handle those different states.
Okay.
Like loading success or error.
So our widgets don't have to worry about the nitty-gritty details of how that data is being fetched.
They don't have to worry about it at all.
They just listen to the future provider.
Exactly.
And react to the appropriate state.
That's it. It simplifies things tremendously.
Wow.
Yeah, and if your data source is like a stream of updates,
Yeah.
Let's say you're building a chat app with real-time messages.
Real-time, that's a good example.
Then Stream Provider steps in to manage that stream,
Okay.
notifying listeners whenever new data arrives.
It's like providers thought of everything.
It really has. It's well thought out.
Yeah. So whether it's a one-time operation with Future Provider or a continuous stream of updates with Stream Provider, Provider has our back.
It does. It's got your back.
This is great. I feel like we've covered so much.
We have covered a lot.
As we wrap up this deep dive, is there like a key message you'd like our listeners to take away?
I think the most important takeaway is that Provider offers this remarkable balance between simplicity and power.
I agree.
It's beginner-friendly enough to get started quickly.
Right.
Yet it scales beautifully to handle those complex state management needs.
It's the best of both worlds.
It really is.
By combining Provider with the principles of clean architecture
Yes.
and thorough testing, we can build these Flutter apps that are not only robust and maintainable, but also a joy to work with.
They really are a joy to work with.
And remember, the Flutter community is a fantastic resource.
It is.
There's a wealth of information available online, from detailed documentation to helpful tutorials.
So don't be afraid to dive in, experiment, and see what you can create.
I love that now that we've resurfaced from this deep dive, is there like a final thought you want to leave our listeners with?
We've talked a lot about what Provider can do, but I challenge you to think about what you would build with it.
Ooh, challenge. I like it.
What kind of app would benefit from its powerful state management capabilities?
A good question for our listeners.
Maybe a collaborative to-do list that updates in real time, or a social media app with dynamic feeds, or even a game with intricate state interactions.
So many possibilities.
The possibilities are endless.
Well, we can't wait to see what amazing Flutter creations you bring to life.
Right there.
With the help of Provider.
It's a fantastic tool.
It is. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and happy coding.